I've had a really warm welcome here, and as JJ said, I'm from British Columbia, but I have been living for the last number of years in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and so I'm also on sabbatical right now. So I've been traveling to a number of countries around the world, trying to understand what are the forms and functions of local energy projects or community energy in different countries, and how do different state forms and state policies shape those forms and functions, shape the contribution of what local actors can do. There are a couple narratives that are really popular. One of them is that people go to communities and local ground up innovation because they're frustrated with the state and that they're going to work around the state. And unfortunately, one of the really important things that I've found through my research is that state policy is still really central in shaping what communities are able to do. So while we absolutely need bottom-up innovation, you can't, for all sorts of reasons, just ignore what the state is up to. So you have to see these things in a relational perspective. But before I progress to the rest of the talk, I just wanted to draw your attention to the little icon on the top right. So that's the icon for WISER. So Christina is the chair of WISER and I'm the co-chair, but what it stands for is Women and Inclusivity in Sustainable Energy Research. It's an open network for people who are interested in renewable energy. It's focused on female academic researchers because a lot of the energy sector research that's been happening in academia is very male dominated, and also a lot of it has been very technocratic. So for many reasons in fields that aren't related necessarily to social sciences. So there's a number of kind of inclusive areas that we're looking to open up. So if anyone's interested in WISER, please come talk to me or Christina after the presentation. But what I'm going to talk about today is, as the title suggests, this idea of energy democracy, which we're hearing this term more and more, but it like community energy or energy justice or a range of other concepts that Daria here sitting in the front row and I are trying to work through, as well as Christina. This is like a talk of many of my collaborators over the years. They're quite fuzzy and they mean different things to different people. And so highlighting some of the tensions, definitions, and overlaps in specific contexts and countries is what I'm going to try to do, and indeed what I spend much of my time doing. So the latter part of the talk, I'd say a third, is where I talk about Aotearoa New Zealand, where I've been from, and highlighting a piece that was actually just published last week, the results of that. But the bulk of it is talking about why should and why does anyone actually care about this term energy democracy? What does it mean? And how is it moving from place to place? So context and concepts. Does anyone know the name of this particular sculpture? No? Or at least no one who's willing to volunteer it. Politicians discussing global warming. So it's Isaac Bardal and it's in Berlin, and I use this in almost all of my environmental politics classes because it is both really depressing, but also I think really well captures this idea that there is a talk fest that has been going on for many, many years as the seas and the waters are rising around those having said talk fest. So there's this deep feeling of frustration, and you see this in the rise of global protests around climate, but the idea is the biosphere is changing, the earth is changing as there's this kind of deadlock when it comes to actually getting action. So I think this image is particularly useful when we're thinking about climate anxiety and how we would innovate around this, how we push for change around these actors. So we need new actors and potentially new strategies. Now, keeping in mind that I absolutely think that these actors bringing in new policies that incentivize, and that is how we're going to get massive, rapid change scaling things that we need to actually still get to these actors. But in order to do that, leverage as many pathways as possible. And sometimes it means using some circuitous routes. So I'm really interested in social movements, mobilizing organizational innovations. How do we change the incentives? How do we get new and different actors involved in something as challenging as the energy sector. And I focus on energy for a couple of reasons, not because I think that's the silver bullet or the only way we're going to address the climate crisis, because it's not. We need to address agriculture and transport and a whole wide range of other areas and issues. But for new, non-traditional actors, particularly those without a lot of money, deep pockets, and institutional connections, the energy sector is a hard case. If we can get significant change in this particular sector, which is a major contributor to climate change in terms of fossil fuels, things are looking better or better than they were before. So this is one of these most recent, this is just on the urgency of dealing with the climate crisis. This is one of the most recent reports from United in Science. So this is from the Science Advisory Group in that, from late 2019, this was published. And essentially it's saying, here are our major findings, that we're already in the warmest 5-year period on record most recently. This is not news to many of you. We're already 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, that climate impacts are hitting harder and sooner. Where I live in New Zealand, many of you may have seen in the news the Australian wildfires. Well, it's the shortest flight from, so let's say from Auckland where I live across to Sydney is 3.5 hours. And I'd left New Zealand on my research sabbatical by this point, but the skies in Auckland, friends were showing pictures of, it looked very post-apocalyptic. So orange skies, 3.5 hour flights away, right? The glaciers on the South Island of New Zealand were turning orange and pink as a result of the wildfire. So that's just one example of how we're seeing radically different environmental conditions in many parts of the world. And for many years, you heard this narrative that, you know, there was this ability, which is disgusting in many ways, to downplay the flooding because it wasn't happening here, right? Well, it is happening in wealthy, industrialized nations who have the capacity to bounce back sooner. So in some ways, the human costs in terms of lives are lower. But there has been this horrible tendency over many years that when the human costs are faced, often in poor countries, so there's this justice dynamic, there's an ability to say, well, it's not us, so it's not here now. Well, it is starting to be here and in countries like here now. So moving forward along, as I go clockwise, emissions are not estimated to peak in 2030, let alone 2020. So this presents a really significant challenge. Not only are we facing the consequences, but we're not even close to turning those lines around. Policies to lower emissions must triple to get to the 2 degree and multiply 5-fold to get to 1.5. So we have a massive policy gap, what scholars in this area call a climate policy underreaction. And I think this is from a UNEP, UN Environment Program report from 2017. And it really illustrates the idea that there's a gray baseline of emissions, current policy trajectories that are the promises countries have already made is the yellow line, so still going up. There are nationally determined contributions, so each country under the most recent frameworks is able to say itself what it is going to do. It may or may not be robust enough and often isn't. And those are the unconditional and conditional, so the red and green. But what I'm most interested in calling your attention to is the difference between the gray and yellow line and the dark purple line. All right, this is the scope of what's ahead of us, and it's this huge policy gap. But even though the policy gap, you know, between those first bunch of lines is significant, the implementation gap is even bigger. So that means even when we make the promises, our nation states and regional governments' ability to actually meet the targets that they've set is really quite shocking. And that creates a number of really puzzling questions for someone who works in politics and public policy, as I do. So one of the reasons we have for this, and one of the reasons we need institutional and actor innovation, which is what's taking us to this argument for energy democracy, is incumbent industrial interests. So we don't get to remake our systems. We have to live with the systems that were developed 20, 30, 40 years ago that created interests in fossil fuels, in nuclear industries, in our transport systems looking the way they do with the particular actors who drive them and benefit from them. And so incumbent industrial interests are one of the reasons we get slower promises than we need to meet the targets that we have, but also why, when the targets are set, we don't meet them in a timely fashion or don't meet them at all. So we get delays. Okay, another 5 years, or let's have another round of consultations. We also have a very active climate denial industry. So this idea that we don't actually need to do any of that. In fact, the former Prime Minister of Australia recently was interviewed in Israeli media and said that climate change is just a conspiratorial cult. And this is a former Prime Minister of a major OECD country. So this is not necessarily something that isn't widespread. Well, it's not as widespread as that, but I remember reading about this particular interview, and the interviewers were shocked so much they felt like they should have maybe done some more back research before they did, but they weren't expecting a former prime minister to be as bald in his climate denial as that. But that is a significant issue in getting actual physical infrastructure changed. We also have some serious issues that are covered in the political science literature in particular and policy literature about blame shifting. So it's the ability for Canada or New Zealand, for example, to say, we are small. China, now that would make a difference. The US, that would make a difference. But in the scale of things, what we do doesn't really matter. So this ability to point to another actor and kind of elide your own responsibilities is something that needs to be tackled more aggressively, because it's certainly a tactic that's being used. At the psychological level, another reason we have these policy underreactions and the implementation gap is because of people's ability to not privilege what's happening in the future. So they discount the future. But more than that is economists' practice of deeply discounting the future, right? So the idea that $1 tomorrow is not worth as much as $1 today. And that makes its way into our cost-benefit analysis, which tell our policymakers what programs to choose. And most importantly for the talk today is this lack of political will and social support. So even though the majority of Canadians, more than 60%, voted for parties who were pro taking action on climate change, and indeed some really interesting research, I think it was last year from La Chapelle and I think Matto Mildenberger, showed that across Canada the vast majority of constituencies actually support more robust action on climate change. That political will and social support for radical change needs to be developed even more. And so with this climate crisis, we have an urgent need to find these new coalitions, actors and strategies, so that we can get policies that go much deeper than they are currently, that they get implemented, and also that they can go past one electoral cycle, so people can push more and more harder. In fact, I gave a talk on energy democracy a few weeks ago in Belfast, and so part of this talk today, and one of the first questions was someone at the back, and they stood up and they said, okay, so at the beginning you start with the climate crisis, and then you do all this talk about democracy, but democracy's too slow. We don't have time for democracy in the climate crisis. But one of the really important things for people to notice is that without social innovation, without behavioral change from individuals and people as well as companies, there is no long-term change that's deep enough to address the climate crisis. Unless all of our countries are going to become authoritarian states where political consent doesn't matter, which is fantasy land, we do need social consensus. Hoffman and Hyde-Pippert have talked about a socio-political infrastructure for transition. So this idea that we need people generally to agree. We don't need every single person to agree. That this isn't kind of pie in the sky, every person is going to want the same thing. But addressing climate change is not politically feasible without a more just and equitable society, because otherwise people are going to be shut out, left out, angry, and then mobilized to overturn exactly those policies. And in order for us to be effective, we need to get ahead of potential opposition. And I'm assuming everyone in the room wants to take action on climate change, but that is not always the case. So we can talk about that in the questions. So before we move forward too much with energy democracy, another thing I wanted to take into account in my title, so first of all, was to unpack the concepts in energy, power, and democracy, but also the idea of a lot of these transitions needing to take place in countries like Canada and New Zealand, which are neoliberal. And that term falls in and out of favor, you know, depends on the decade, depends on the scholar. Sometimes it can be too broad to be particularly useful. But I'm going to talk a little bit about what I mean about that. But the neoliberal setting really, in my research anyway, has highlighted, it kind of sets the parameters for what a particular government is willing to do or not to, who they're willing to support and not support, and it affects the types of climate policies generally that we get. But first, the concepts of energy and power. So for most people, they're thinking about this one on the left, either the wires, the generating stations, the power system. Now, power is not necessarily synonymous with energy, so the energy sector is broader than the power sector. Sometimes when I give this talk, I show a graph and it's got electricity on one side and energy on the other. And many countries like New Zealand are highly renewable when it comes to electricity, like 83% is geothermal and hydro, etc. But the energy also includes things like the fuel for your car, which is often fossil fuels, right? Diesel or petrol, the fuel for all sorts of other things, heating your homes with things that aren't electricity. So it's much broader. And many countries, Canada and New Zealand and others included, there's a different profile for both of these things. But most of what I'm talking about falls under the power sector. But in my work, I highlight how the power sector and the energy sector is also about different kinds of power. So it's that socio-political infrastructure that allows for lines to go one place and also highlights who benefits from and who gets to decide for where and how that infrastructure manifests in a particular place. And I intentionally chose two quite different images for the idea of power. So the one on the top right is a Swedish climate activist. Many of you may know of, Greta Thunberg. And I chose her because of the power of the school strikes for climate. Now, she is just one person, and many people have pointed out she did not do everything on her own, and there were many other young activists in Canada and abroad who also were really instrumental in this. But there is certainly power in her ability to mobilize and articulate and get people from all around the world to continue mobilizing. That's power as well. And that kind of power informs what we're going to be able to do on the left-hand side, and that power. The other, I think, is relevant for countries like Canada and New Zealand in post-colonial settings, or some people would say continually colonial settings. So this is from a Trans-Pacific Partnership protest in New Zealand, and this is a Maori female activist, and this is a line of police. And the reason I really like this image as well to illustrate the concept of power is because power doesn't exist without opposition, right? That power is a contest between actors in a society. So the image on the bottom right illustrates that often if you're trying to exercise your power or you're trying to change things, there's going to be opposition to that, sometimes in the form of police, right? Or the form of the state, or the form of other actors working against you. Similarly, with the concepts of energy and power, democracy, for those who aren't political scientists, so I collaborate with people from a number of different disciplines and speak quite often at public talks, and democracy is this. A democratic country is a country where there's voting, but where citizens have the ability to shape who sits in decision making. Political scientists and policy scholars often study that, well, power doesn't necessarily just rest with those representative actors. Often it's the lobbyers and lobbyists who shape those actors and their decisions, or unelected civil servants, or there's much more complex, but there's a kind of narrow view of democracy that it's all about representation. You have power when you are able to elect someone to represent you, whether they do so well or not. There's this other kind of longer standing critique and debate between representation as democracy versus participation as democracy. And you'll see this woven throughout my talk, that when we talk about community energy, there's a difference in how we categorize projects that are about you had a say. Someone asked your opinion and you gave it, and then they did what they wanted to do with that opinion, or whether you had a debate about meaningful things and you had power to change the outcome. Deliberation doesn't mean you have that power, but it is a more complex understanding of what democracy entails, the control of citizens over their surroundings. So moving forward, we have this idea of a climate crisis. We have this idea that we might need new actors, different forms of power, and that energy is about more than the wires and the generation. It's also about this socio-political bit underneath. And I highlighted to you that the nation state, which a lot of political scientists spend a lot of time studying, is really important because we also have different state forms, more or less consensual, more or less authoritarian. And one of the kind of characteristics that has really dominated since, mid-70s, but certainly 80s and 90s in countries like Canada and New Zealand is this idea of neoliberalism, which essentially is a focus on markets. Markets as a solution to political problems. And the idea that the state is going to steer a boat and not actually row the boat. That it's the private sector that's going to do the innovating and the work, and the state's role is to provide the market-based settings and parameters. So uphold public or private property. And free trade, so extend the trading opportunities and the accumulation opportunities for private actors. And this focus on these particular kind of goals for government are particularly strong in Canada, in the UK, in New Zealand, in the United States. And there's an emphasis here on individual entrepreneurial freedoms and skills, which someone like David Harvey talks about. Scholars of neoliberalism also highlight, and this is the image on the right, the idea that individuals are going to innovate and companies and pull themselves up by their bootstraps. This is an Australian Blundstone type boot. I don't know if anyone has these, so straps, and there you go. So this kind of self-help mentality. And the reason that I think putting community and energy democracy in a neoliberal context and trying to understand that is so important is that a lot of the idea of bottom-up innovation fits quite neatly and nicely with the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, local people solving problems themselves, not waiting for the state to get in there and do it for them, right? There are also some tensions there, but local and community energy developing in these contexts doesn't necessarily, rhetorically anyway, challenge that narrative of market exchange or of kind of self-help. It actually fits right in it. Now, there are other aspects of local and community energy that can be quite challenging, but it also can fit as a complement. Peck and Tickle, for example, when they're talking about neoliberalism, they highlight that this process has both it exists in these roll-out and roll-back variants. And the roll-out variants are creating new market opportunities, new areas for private accumulation that didn't exist before, right? So commodifying the atmosphere, right? Turning that into a trading market. Roll-back variants, they don't specifically talk about climate in that. They're talking about social services and other things more broadly. But roll-back variants include things like areas that were publicly provided that then are rolled back for private accumulation. And so in this context, a lot of countries like New Zealand and like Canada have been really focused on private accumulation as a way to get green growth, for example. To solve the climate crisis, we're going to look at ways to create new market opportunities so that actors can mobilize their own finance and step in and solve some of these problems. So I have seen in my own research as well, a real focus on policy emphasis on not picking winners is the language that a lot of interviewees have used, right? So when it comes to energy transitions, moving from more fossil fuels to less, moving from, transport systems or smart grids or things like that, we're going to let the actors compete, and the best ones that can compete are the best ones to solve the problem. But we're not going to put hard regulations, and we're not going to say only nonprofits, let's say, for example, or only collective actors are going to be able to provide this service. I mention that as a specific example because I'm going to give you the example of Denmark in a couple slides, and that is indeed exactly what they did when they started their community energy sector. So I wanted to just highlight here how New Zealand, people often think about, especially contemporarily, as Jacinda Ardern in the US with her baby and her partner. And as it has, there's been a marketing campaign for many years that New Zealand is clean and green, right? This kind of tourist mecca, and I indeed think it's the most gorgeous place. It's very beautiful, and you'll see some pictures that highlight this, but it also kind of flies under the radar in terms of what Jane Kelsey, who's a law prof at the University of Auckland, has called New Zealand Chile without guns, and at the pure end of the neoliberal spectrum. So the current government in New Zealand notwithstanding, the political context there has been one of many years of state restructuring. And so that includes, for example, the state contracting out services to private actors to provide housing, social care, and things like that. Like Canada, there's still a public healthcare system, right? So it's mixed. But when it comes to the way they retooled, for example, the electricity sector, and in New Zealand, they completely retracted any kind of farming subsidies. So farmers in New Zealand operate without subsidies. And the argument there is now they're the most efficient in the world because they're not reliant on them. So on steroids. And when I was doing a review of New Zealand energy policy, there's the quote on the right. And for those of you that the text is too small, I'll read it out. So this is former Environment Minister Nick Smith in 2009. The government's environmental agenda is about rolling back nanny state regulations and achieving better environmental outcomes through financial incentives. So this encapsulates exactly what I'm talking about with the kind of neoliberal context we're dealing in here. Our balanced approach aims for New Zealand to be both environmentally and economically sustainable. So you see some of the language around sustainable development, but the focus primarily is not on the government telling people what to do, the nanny state regulations, or setting prices at a particular place, or driving development in particular areas. It's about hands off, not picking winners. So there are a number of contradictions and tensions in the political economy scholarship that highlights where this might go. So one of them comes from actually Polanyi's work in 1944, which I'm returning to after a bit of a break. And Polanyi articulated when he was trying to talk about kind of the Industrial Revolution and also the dislocations created in market societies, right? So the idea is if you break up communal land and you move people into these kind of industrial market-based settings, then you create, so he was also actually trying to deal with the idea that markets can exist outside of societies, that this kind of trading could exist outside of the social foundations. And he actually talked about it like it was a stark utopia, this idea of a disembedded free market that doesn't actually follow the needs or wants or interests of the people operating in it. And so he really highlighted the social foundations of economic institutions. And there's a really great quote where he's talking about that the more you take market logic away from social foundations, the more that you're going to get a double movement of social actors coming and reclaiming the market for environmental and social purposes. So this idea of a double movement or a push and pull. And I think that the movement towards energy democracy in many places is part of this kind of Polanyian double movement. The idea that this area has operated outside the environmental needs and wants and also the economic interests of many populations, and we need a way to kind of reclaim and retake that. But the neoliberal kind of shift in both New Zealand and Canada and in a number of countries, the UK included, also has opened up space for new actors. And it's done so by when public utilities are broken up or space in energy markets is created, let's say in British Columbia or Ontario, for private actors to generate electricity, to develop grids, to participate in the sector. Some of those actors may end up being local, democratically controlled cooperatives and otherwise. So there's some tensions that have evolved as the neoliberal restructuring has also restructured, and it has been accompanied by a corresponding decentralization pushed by environmental movements, but also by neoliberalism in the restructuring of power sectors. So some really interesting and quite messy. It's not as easy as saying that this is good or bad. It is going to look very different in different places. And I know there are a number of students, grad students, in the audience today. And if I could leave, I mean, I have lots of advice, but one piece would be, don't allow the push to make your work just purely theoretical. Ignore the really, really rich contextual place that you're living in. I don't know how many of you are trying to publish, but often you're pushed more and more in that direction. And because things are actually so messy on the ground, it's really important for us to understand that rather than just come up with simple narratives. So the other space opened up for new actors is groups like Co-operatives that I wrote about in the book Empowering Electricity and with some other recent articles, but also Indigenous communities. And this is where that post-colonial setting really starts to matter again. So there's a really excellent book that came out in 2018. It's an edited anthology by Howard Wagner, Maria Barge, Altamirano Jimenez, and it tracks basically Indigenous post-colonial struggles within neoliberalism and identifies this kind of tension between Indigenous communities being harmed deeply by neoliberal marketization shifts, but at the same time, they have enabled space for private actors, of which, and we'll talk about this more in the New Zealand context, many Indigenous communities can play a role that they weren't able to before because it was so centralized with the state, any of these functions. So there's this, again, opening up of opportunities. But I was interviewing someone for the Empowering Electricity book in Nova Scotia, a policymaker, and I was asking them why they brought in policies to enable more local and community energy development, and essentially they said, well, we actually didn't think anyone would take them up. It was there as an opportunity, but we didn't really expect it. And so there are unintended consequences, I think, that have come from some of these shifts, right? So a government may make some symbolic policies as kind of a nod to a group of people and then be totally taken aback by the response. Indeed, that's what happened in the UK. So I was recently there doing some research, and in the United Kingdom, they brought in a set of community energy supportive policies really strongly in kind of 2014, around there, like a feed-in tariff and whatnot. And sorry for those of you who aren't familiar with power sector policy, but financial supports to pay you to sell them power at a price that would make it financially feasible. And they were flooded with applications, so much so that just a couple years later they completely slashed it and then got rid of it altogether. But there was so much pent-up demand from all of these local groups who wanted to participate in generating green energy. So really, I'm really interested in, and this is going to be a long, long project, understanding, given these kind of tensions, what is emerging, what has emerged in different countries, what kinds of community energy projects exist, and are they part of a counter movement, or are they just part of business as usual and a small part of a broader sector? But I did promise some definitions about the confusion or the slippy terminology around energy democracy. So though it is used in slightly different ways by different actors, the broad idea is, well, you see down below, right? People with the placards, but it's a solar power. It's the idea of kind of power for the people, or citizen power, both in terms of participation, but also in terms of the actual physical power that's generated in our communities. So there's elements of participation, control, and then Sweeney articulates these 3 R's. So the participation is, there's kind of 2 elements in planning and decision-making around the energy sector. It's not just what I've been mentioning around citizen-owned generation or grids. So, for example, are you contributing to Ontario's energy plan? Is there a way to do that? And a way to do that in that actually makes its way into the plan, as opposed to just being consulted and then letting it go. In some countries, they're actually actively doing this. So climate forums, citizens forums, bottom-up kind of mobilizing, more active citizen participation. And there are a couple justifications, but one of them is that the more we bring people along on board, the less likely they are to oppose it after we bring it in, rather than doing it first and expecting them to just understand the science or the benefits. Sometimes it can also allow policymakers and government actors to adjust things so that they can, again, get ahead of opposition. And more radically is kind of citizen participation in policy and planning that allows the citizens to not just choose off of or discuss a predetermined topic, but actually redesign what the goal might be. So not just help policymakers achieve a goal, but start setting the goals of the policy as well as the means and the how. Control is another element, and that's what I've been talking about and will focus on more the rest of the presentation, this idea that local and community energy ownership of not just generation assets, but of the power grids, of energy demand control, and all sorts of other parts of the energy sector that increasingly, with the rise of smart grids and electrification of transport, are part of this really kind of complex network of services and activities. They're not just these discrete areas. And one really interesting one as well is the retailing. Where do you buy your power from? Who gets the profit from that? Who gets the benefit of that? So the retailing of power is a complex area, but it's one that communities in some places are participating in. So Sweeney's 3 R's, and this comes out of the American kind of definition and social movement kind of genesis of energy democracy, is resisting fossil fuel industry expansion, reclaiming public ownership of energy assets and planning, there's those 2 elements, and restructuring energy systems to increase renewables, conservation, and the development of low carbon employment options. And this takes us right into discussions of just transitions, right? So how do we create institutions that provide decent jobs and allow people who are fuel poor or just disconnected completely for having more control and more say? And this is an area where in New Zealand, fuel poverty, and I know in many parts of Canada, is a serious challenge, and it's also very gendered and racialized, right? So this is a challenge for particular communities, not everyone. But these are often the communities who are least represented in political circles, right? So how do we find a way to bring those voices and the benefits of an energy transition to a much wider group of people? So scholars who have been, so energy democracy as a term originated more out of this kind of US social movement kind of literature, but people who have been talking about democratization or citizen ownership or community energy in all sorts of other jurisdictions before Sweeney kind of talked about that term. But what I want to highlight here, that energy democracy is not, and Terry and I are going to talk about this more tomorrow, I think, is not necessarily, it overlaps with the concept of energy justice, but it's not exactly the same thing. So you can think about an energy system that is democratic, that allows for participation of citizens, let's say, in citizens' forums, or may even allow for the participation, like in Toronto here. One of the reasons why I study this area is because the Windshare turbine, owned by the Toronto Renewable Electricity Cooperative, down at Exhibition Place, that isn't spinning right now, I read an article about it, and I was like, that's so interesting. It's the local municipal utility partnering with a cooperative. It's citizen energy. It was the first turbine like it in an urban area in North America, so it's innovative. And I was so interested in understanding more. So that's energy democracy. An energy justice lens, though, would ask us to say, all right, so who is participating? Are the people that need help the most benefiting from that particular project, right? Are injustices from the past being rectified by this particular initiative or project, right? You could definitely see, and this is where some of the tensions in the area are really emerging, and I haven't really solved them yet, that let's say a centralized, large-scale system that provides very cheap power and enables everyone to get things at a cheap, that might not necessarily tick your climate justice boxes, but it may certainly tick some of your fuel poverty boxes and thus some energy justice ones. Now, you could undermine that by saying, well, without climate justice and addressing climate change, there is no energy justice. And you can go around with that, but again, I think the justice lens is, are we helping those who need it most, right? are people who didn't contribute to the problem being unfairly penalized. And there are overlaps in that some people think developing energy democracy is more likely to get us to energy justice. So it's a mechanism for energy justice. But again, I'm just pointing out that they're not necessarily synonymous. So the one area I spend most of my time in is that within energy democracy more broadly is not the kind of public consultations, but local and community energy. So how do people around a particular change or transition or energy installment, how do they participate? So Walker and Divine Right kind of have this characterization where community energy is where the project is open and participatory, so open to actors who aren't just energy industry elites or specialists or policymakers, so beyond the usual suspects. And it's also the outcomes are local and collective. So this is about how the process goes. Do people get a say in where the turbines go? Or is it somebody putting them where the wind resource is best, which might be good for technocratic reasons, but might not be good for social acceptability. So this is old, and a lot of people have built on this and developed it, and you can have all these different levels of local participation versus local benefits. You don't necessarily have to have both with the project, but the idea is if you have both benefits to the people who are proximate to the technology and they were able to have a say in what happens, that's strong community energy, and that is most likely to benefit people, right? So on the right-hand side, the bottom picture, for those of you who can't read, it says Transfield, which is an energy company, go stick your 80 wind turbines somewhere else, try Sydney. So this kind of illustrates the idea that many people started looking to this kind of community energy or participation in the energy sector because they recognized that to roll out new energy infrastructure, power infrastructure, not just generation, but Christina and I have written on this, the scope and scale of an energy transition to transform what is in your area, your local neighborhood, the transport, the grid, the investment that's going to be required, but also the proximate. It's going to happen around you, which means that you need social license and social purpose in a democracy, and you need to find a way to bring people along. And so the argument was giving them a financial stake or financial benefit, or making sure that those benefits accrue to those proximate stakeholder populations is one way to do that. So I told you I'd give you an example of where this has worked. So Denmark is a country that many people who study energy democracy, but certainly citizen and collective energy, they focus a lot of their research. Part of the reason is because they started this transition in the 1970s. So after the OPEC crisis, they realized that they were very dependent on imported oil, and they wanted to start an energy transition back then. And I just came off of a range of interviews with community energy people, but also policymakers in Denmark. And they were strategically targeting their transition so that they addressed this exposure to oil markets, but also so that they got a leg up on developing new industries. So their government investment and their focus on community enabled the social license for them to roll out wind power on a scale that other countries have not been able to, or have been, rolled them out, and then so many people got very angry they unelected the party in power, or they really mobilized against, let's say, just sticking with wind turbines, new turbines. So the map here of Denmark shows in 1990, you see a few dots, and that was the kind of power generation in the country at the time. And on the right-hand side, you see all the tiny dots. So they seriously decentralized. And the way they were able to decentralize was that they provided significant tax breaks for local and community ownership of wind. So you had places like Samso, which I just got to visit, which is an energy island, and the farmers and landowners on the island own the offshore and onshore turbines and get a financial benefit, and have an energy academy where now they travel all over the world and they show people the benefits of this. So a number of the kind of theorized benefits of local and community energy include economic development in rural and urban areas, with the funds going to people who wouldn't normally benefit from energy sector funds. A reduction of NIMBYism, or not in my backyard, kind of rejection of projects, but also to things like education, and that idea that for many people who have no interaction with the sector other than flicking a light switch, right? Whereas other aspects of climate policy, even in your food systems, you see more, even though some of it's distance. The energy sector is not something most people think about, until they get a bill or until the lights don't work. So it engages people at a level that helps to shift, this is the theory, their thinking about it, their awareness of it, their willingness to support new initiatives to make it better. There are all sorts of downsides too that we can potentially talk about in the questions, but Denmark is really interesting. So this project on the right was set up a little bit actually like Windshare, but it is a massive, when it was first built, it was the largest offshore wind project in the world. And it's the Middelgrunden project, and it's half owned by a cooperative, which has some teachers groups in it and local citizens and all of this, and, the municipal utility. And the picture on the far right is me and someone else, and we recently you get to take a Zodiac out to the offshore turbines, and you have to pay, and it's a tour type thing, but for energy geeks, it's pretty fun. But you get to climb up on the turbine and go inside and learn about it, and there's so many fascinating things about this project, but one of the most is that the man who took me out to the turbine in the Zodiac, he said, I take stag parties out here. This is a tourist attraction. You can see it from the city of Copenhagen. And he's like, a lot of people, it's fun being on a Zodiac out in a harbor, but the spin-off benefits go far beyond. It's wind power, not coal. It's, again, this kind of social interaction with energy technology that changes the way that people think about things. So in this recent article that Anna Burka, myself, and one of my PhD students wrote, it's about inclusivity and energy transitions in New Zealand, but we try to characterize how did a place like Denmark get where it did? Lots of other people are working on this, but in terms of policies, how did they have, because that Middelgrunden is just one project of many, many. Most of their heat and power, their combined heat and power, but also their district heating systems are all run by cooperatives. So one member, one vote, kind of citizen-owned, you get to participate, vote on boards, all of this stuff, and the revenues go back into the project rather than to investors somewhere else. So there's this kind of closed loop in terms of the benefits, which are really interesting. So we talk about, at the very basic level, you need a legal framework. If you want to do something with someone else, you need to be able to go to a lawyer or someone else and set up a company that allows you lots of people to own it, and own it on a nonprofit basis, let's say, and own it collectively, and you need a legal form. So in some places that's cooperatives, in others it's trusts, but you need something that isn't so new, you have to lobby the lawyers to learn about the new form, There's like levels of difficulty. You need access to a market in a neoliberal setting. You need to be able to sell or trade that power or operate without, violating the rules that someone else has to use that resource. You need incentives often. So places like Denmark had, again, tax breaks for community groups or special incentives to help them get going, because it is not a level playing field between energy sector actors. You need resource planning and access. So the ability, again, through resource planning, not just legal and financial rules. And then there's a lot in some of these countries of soft policy. So feasibility studies are really expensive, kind of testing what is the wind resource like, just to stick with wind as an example. So there's a lot of policy supports that went into creating a sector like that. So the last bit of my talk, I'm going to focus on New Zealand, and then what I promised, that insights from neoliberal contexts, okay? So New Zealand, I'm assuming most of you don't know too much about it, but like Canada, greenhouse gas emissions have gone up significantly since 1990. So not down, not that trajectory we're trying to find. And what's interesting about that upward trajectory, flat maybe in the last 10 years or so, is that these are the countries, New Zealand, Canada, et cetera, that have the most financial resources, right? These are not the poor countries of the world. These are technologically advanced, wealthy countries, right? So we should be seeing more, not less, in terms of reductions. So post-1990 in New Zealand, we've seen 80% increases in transport emissions. There are lots of reasons for that, but New Zealand has 83% renewable electricity. That 80% increase in transport is because the vehicle fleet is so old, and it is incredibly inefficient. So vehicle electrification in a place like New Zealand would make a huge difference to the emissions profile, because then you have renewable electricity powering a shift from old diesel, inefficient, oil-powered, internal combustion engine vehicles to not. The share of renewable electricity, I take it back, 84%, which is very high in the world. Hydro's at 60%, and New Zealand has a significant chunk of geothermal as well. So already very renewable. And so when I first gave presentations in this area in New Zealand, they said, okay, so we don't need this. We're already really renewable. But what's so important is that the energy transition that we need to have to get those greenhouse gases down isn't just about more renewable energy. It's about demand. It's about fuel poverty. It's about retailing. It's about shifting grids and transport and all these other things. And while a lot of the early scholarship on community energy focused just on generation, the newer stuff that I'm doing with a number of other people, it's about the whole sector and related sectors. How do we democratize all of this? So yes, there's still a slice of New Zealand generation that needs to shift away from fossil fuels, but the big challenges are about home insulation and making sure we don't waste energy that we're already generating, and making sure that poorer people and people shut out have access to what we do. So the IEA in 2017, International Energy Agency, came out saying New Zealand is lacking the policy instruments for a rapid energy transition. Again, this is before the new government came in and announced a range of different, they had a zero carbon bill in 2018, which included planting 1 billion trees as carbon sinks, for example, and 100% renewable energy by 2035. But again, this is about policy promises, and what I illustrated at the beginning is the gap, massive gap even between policies and reaching those policies. So we're trying to find the mechanisms to get that actually done. The other thing in New Zealand that's really important is that election cycles are only 3 years. You get elected, you have a year, and then you're back into elections again. And this is again why the kind of technocratic, let's just do the energy transition, misses so much when it doesn't take into account getting people on board past, one particular election, because there's no way a government's going to be able to get things in and lock down for the future. You need to keep building that mobilization past any one particular government, which is why making sure that people are engaged across a country and building big cross kind of class and industry coalitions to keep that moving is so important, which is going to entail compromise, which for some is very, very painful. The other thing in New Zealand is that there's been significantly increasing inequality. So there's this very deep post-colonial legacy, as there is in Canada, and a lot of attention on the importance of Māori sovereignty. So Māori, as a percentage of the population, is significantly higher than Indigenous communities, Indigenous and First Nations communities in Canada here. But there is a similar, a lot of people look at New Zealand and say, oh, wow, there's a lot more institutional kind of acknowledgement of that post-colonial history. And there's Māori seats, for example. So when you vote, if you're Māori, you're going to choose whether you vote in the general election seats or the Māori seats, and you get to self-identify. So there's, ways for there to be political representation that are stronger in many ways than what we'd see in Canada. However, ask any Māori scholar or any scholar really who's paying attention, and there are really deep inequalities that persist today across all sectors. That said, Maria Barge, so a colleague of mine, she's the head of Māori studies at Vic, and anyone interested in kind of neoliberalism and indigeneity, definitely read her work. She's brilliant. But she talks about, it's important to note that and these are my obligatory gorgeous pictures of New Zealand, while Tino Rangatiratanga, which is kind of, the idea is sovereignty, may be limited by government and neoliberal trade agreements, Māori are independently strengthening it in all sorts of ways. So one of the interesting things I found from the New Zealand context is the strength of Indigenous ways of thinking about the environment, leveraging kind of some of the settlements from the Treaty of Waitangi and violations of that treaty by the colonial government, and doing really exciting things on the environmental politics front in the country. So returning land to communal ownership, pursuing development activities that don't subscribe entirely to the dominant ways of conducting business. This is all Maria's words. And strengthening practices that reaffirm values and worldviews contrary to neoliberal ones. For example, one of the really interesting trends in New Zealand has been ascribing personhood or giving legal personhood to mountains and rivers so that those elements of the natural world are represented in court, as opposed to it just being a challenge between different human interests for that particular river or the mountain. And so often my students are like, how does that work? It's not like, you know, the mountain sidles into court or anything. Well, typically what's happening is, let's say a panel or a body of representatives, human representatives, is appointed, and it's almost always at least half Maori. So from the traditional people of that area, and then government representatives, and it's their job to say, has the integrity of the river been compromised here? And then taking others to court for that, rather than relying on the state and environmental agencies to do that themselves. So it's this extra step. So this has been done with the Waikato River Authority in 2010, the Te Urewera Act in 2014, Te Awa Tupua, which is the Whanganui River, in 2017, and there are a number of others. So for studying ways of doing things differently or thinking about the world in different ways, New Zealand's not the only country that has been looking at this for sure, but they have rolled it out in more places, particularly in recent years. And many of you may be asking, well, what does this have to do with energy democracy? Well, a few things. One, incorporating these ideas about nature and humans and the relationship into energy developments is a pretty radical shift. This is one of the benefits of inclusivity and democracy in energy transitions, is taking into account the ideas of people who aren't the usual suspects, right? That's one. Another is that if there are financial benefits or considerations about who benefits, the people who have been, let's say, historically wronged in a geographic area should be at the table when deciding how that needs to be redesigned going forward. So there are a range of really exciting projects going on in New Zealand. So Anna and Claudia and I characterized these, this is from this recent publication, into 4 groups. So under that umbrella term of community or local energy, groups who aren't necessarily profit driven, they may make it, but it gets recirculated back into the area. They're non-traditional energy actors, sometimes operating in partnership with more traditional ones. We categorized new environmental organizations separately because we saw that, you know, people who are trying to respond to the climate crisis were a different group than some of these others in terms of their motivations, but also in terms of what they ended up developing in the energy sector. Local authorities, because some of the discourse around community energy doesn't talk about the role of towns and cities. However, that's pretty problematic, especially if you're thinking about energy democracy as a reclaiming of the public. So kind of leaving it out by definitional fiat. We recognize that there's a difference between an agent of the state or the state in a local area from these new environmental organizations, but we wanted them in our data set. So what we're doing here is, no one had really done this in New Zealand, so we Google searched and looked through companies' registers, and we plunked in the word community or cooperative or energy or all of the variations we could think of. And we came up with, my notes tell me exactly how many, 197 organizations that represented 359 megawatts of generation capacity. So not tiny little projects, but that's actually quite a bit, and you'll learn why in a second. And 11 billion New Zealand dollars in assets. And so the other thing that's interesting about mapping a sector like this is thinking about, if you're trying to make changes, knowing who are the actors and what resources do they have, and do they talk to each other yet? Do they think about themselves as a sector? And the answer to many of these things is no. We also categorized Maori-owned energy organizations separately. Again, different motivations, different resources. and locally owned consumer trusts and cooperatives. And the reason those aren't in with new environmental organizations is many times they weren't set up for environmental motivations. Many cooperatives and trusts were set up in, let's say, in New Zealand through the process of electricity restructuring. And the state said you can sell it off and privatize, or you can set up this kind of quasi-community form, and some sold it and they're private, and others are these trusts. But they weren't set up for environmental reasons or to deal with climate change. They were set up as local associations because they used to be municipal utilities. And the state saw this local private-ish ownership as kind of halfway to privatization, and they just never made it the rest of the way. So I'm going to go through a few examples. We have a couple more minutes, I know. Thank you for your patience, and I'm sorry it's warm and I've been blathering for a while. But one of these examples is Te Kura Whare. So Te Kura Whare was New Zealand's one of their first green buildings, so net zero buildings. And it is in Tanueta, and it was developed by Ngāi Tūhoi, so one of the Māori tribes in the area. So there are many different Māori tribes and many different sub-communities, and they have different language. So much like Canada, there's a lot of diversity. You can't speak about some monolithic Māoridom, right? So Ngāi Tūhoi developed this, and one of the things that they talk about when it was developed, so Tamati Kruger was Tūhoi's chief negotiator with the Crown. So again, this kind of process of settlements, of treaty violations, enabled some resources to come back to communities, and they were deciding what to do. And in many, one of the priorities was resilience. How do we not have to rely on the state actors, or private companies who may or may not think we're worth fixing the lines quickly for, or things like that. You find this, I certainly found this when I was interviewing rural Canadians about the electricity sector cooperatives they set up. So the idea is we're not big enough or important enough or rich enough to get the good, quick service. So this is something I heard down in New Zealand as well. But what Tamati Kruger said is, quote, "I haven't paid $1 of my money for electricity, and when the cyclones came and all the electricity was cut, people came to the Kura Whare because we could still give them a cup of tea and a meal. We decided to build more of these buildings." So the idea that this kind of local and community ownership changes what they build. This isn't an upper middle class person putting solar on their roof, right? They're building a central area for people to gather when the inevitable storms and when the consequences essentially of climate change, but also things that have been happening for a long time. But since they're predicted to intensify, having places for people to have access to a fridge, to keep some food, to get food, is more important. So another project is the Eastern Bays Energy Trust. And so some of these, particularly the fourth group, they're energy trusts. And as I said, when New Zealand broke up its power system, trusts became the ownership model for a lot of the distribution networks. So the lines in kind of local areas, right, are owned by trusts. And the money that they get for the use of that, circulating the power between houses and factories and all of that, they put back into the local communities. So again, instead of, and in Alberta, when I was interviewing these kind of groups, they talked about themselves, the rural electric cooperatives, and the IOUs. And the IOUs are investor-owned utilities. So the idea that, there's the kind of private sector activity in this area, and they have different motivations for what they do with the profit or the money that they get. So the Eastern Bay Energy Trust distributed $34.1 million in community funds over, maybe a 10 to 15 year period. Each year, 60% of the net income is distributed as grant funding for energy-related purposes. $750,000 goes to applicants from community organizations, and $750,000 for projects that are initiated by the trustees of the organization. So this is things like moving power lines from overground to underground so that when it gets really windy, the power doesn't go out. They fund scholarships for local people to go and study at universities, and a lot of the local population is Indigenous and Māori, right? They fund improvements to schools. This is something I've definitely seen in the research in the UK as well, is that a lot of the money goes back into what economists would think of as a local economic multiplier, to keeping open the local pub, There was one project, where the energy from it was a whiskey distillery, but they were using the kind of leftover excess to heat the local swimming pool next door, the community swimming pool. So when you have actors in an area who are making decisions about what to do with extra funds or whatnot, you tend to get these kinds of spin-off effects, not just, anyhow. So another one of the projects is the Mokai plant. So this is why the generation numbers are so high in New Zealand. So Mokai is a 113 megawatt, which is big, geothermal plant owned by Tuatapaki Trust in partnership with Mercury Energy, which is an energy company in New Zealand. So they have a geothermal station there that was one of the largest, which one is it? So it's Aotearoa was the world's largest geothermal turbine. So one really important point I want to make is that local and community doesn't have to be small. A lot of people think that. It just has to have that local and community either benefit or control in terms of planning. So a lot of this are Māori trusts in certain areas, and Māori have a lot of concentration on the North Island is over the geothermal plateau. So they have this historical use of geothermal assets for cooking purposes, the hot boiling water that comes up, for spiritual purposes, but also, to heat homes and things like that. So there's long-term knowledge of the area, and a lot of those assets through colonization were taken away, right? So the state-owned companies built and used a geothermal asset, and this is almost in some ways a Polanyian type, retake of the social purpose and mission. So there's some controversy as well, because obviously well-resourced tribes have those benefits, and they had to fight for them. They weren't just given, I don't want to say that was easy, but there's obviously big differences between tribes in different parts of the country, and not all have that. So one of the arguments against this kind of decentralized community model of power transitions is that, one of the roles of the state, if it's working effectively, is to redistribute. Now, people can say, well, they don't typically do that very well. All you need to look at is, the poor drinking water in lots of parts of Canada concentrated in First Nations and rural communities. But hypothetically, a distributive or redistributive role is something you'd want incorporated into a multi-level governance scheme. Okay, two more. So this is one of those new environmental organizations, and unfortunately it's not a positive story, though it is, because they're just getting finished with a climate house or a zero carbon kind of climate demonstration house. But Blue Skin Resilient Communities Trust was trying to form an electricity, it wasn't a cooperative, it was a trust, but near the city of Dunedin. So in a bedroom community of Dunedin, they wanted to put a few small turbines up on a local hill. And they had significant support and also significant opposition, and they've been at this as long as I was in New Zealand, as long as I have been in New Zealand, right, for the last 7 years, and were recently turned down after an appeal to the Environment Court. The proponents have had death threats from people in the community. The explanation I've been given, not for the death threats because I wasn't interviewing on that necessarily, was the idea that as a bedroom community, some people just wanted to retire there and look out over the water, and they didn't want the NIMBYism, right? And so the idea is even community doesn't necessarily overcome NIMBYism. The other thing that I learned from this particular project is, and actually in the interviews I was doing in SAMSO, is that personalities matter incredibly. And the people behind the project were fabulous, really outgoing, very passionate about building local climate resilience. They were interested in starting the project because they were flooded, the region was flooded, and much like Te Kura Whare, they wanted to build, something so that they could, have a bit of that energy resilience in the future, build the capacities and skills. But in SAMSO, what I learned there was that making sure that you have the right people around the table, not necessarily the people with the money or the titles, but those kind of the social capital of people in a small community, and make sure you get them on board before community consultations, that this kind of social knowledge is essential to getting this kind of stuff rolled out. And I mean, that's not groundbreaking necessarily, but that's certainly not the way a lot of energy developers think. right? So, who are the right people who don't have a title and might not have a salary around the table? And sometimes it's someone's grandma or grandpa, right, who's retired, but everybody listens to them and likes them. So if they come, you're flying. So the other area that doesn't get nearly enough attention in community energy, local energy research is energy efficiency and retrofit. So the idea of not generating more stuff or developing a big business opportunity, but just fixing things that aren't working well. So a lot of the nonprofit community groups, the community energy actors, are working in this area in New Zealand. And this is where we come back to this history of neoliberalism, because in New Zealand, because they have already a lot of renewable power generation, they haven't put in a lot of those policies in that triangle I showed you earlier. They haven't had incentives, any, for community actors. Some Māori actors had some ownership in the geothermal, largely because of the treaty settlements process. There are those distribution companies that have existed also through the history of restructuring. But in terms of kind of new actors developing community energy assets, most of them have emerged in energy efficiency because what the government did have in New Zealand, due to the shocking state of the housing sector with no insulation and poorly built homes, was an energy efficiency retrofit program. And so a lot of nonprofit groups around the country set up to apply or implement that. So they're the ones who went into homes to do a lot of the consulting. So this particular project in Bluff, at the bottom bit of the South Island, is Aotearoa Synergy, and it is a Māori-owned group that does this, that's done a huge swath of retrofits all across Invercargill. It has all Māori staff, so one of the spin-off benefits of this particular project, obviously, is the training and employment, but also, through some of the interviews I did there, they're doing a lot of extra work in kind of, I wouldn't say combating racism, but dealing with racism against the perception of Māori as, in some communities, not particularly skilled tradespeople. And so those workers going into homes are having to combat and deal with that, and then have training about how to respond, but then through that process over time change the ideas of people living in that area about that portion of the population. It's not work they should have to do, and it's extra work on top of their actual job, but the spin-off benefits of having different actors means that you can engage with some of these really negative stereotypes. So this is a count of projects on the left, and it's just highlighting how there are a lot of generation projects in New Zealand, but most of them are not new environmental organizations, and a lot of them are either consumer-owned power boards or iwi or Māori-owned. But a lot of the rest of the activity in New Zealand is in energy efficiency and the distribution trusts. Okay, wrapping up here, a couple points. So there are significant challenges to what we consider energy democratization, not just from the New Zealand case, but from a number of the countries I've been studying around the world. And I intentionally put that picture on the right-hand side of the Trojan horse. So a number of people, scholars increasingly are developing, and I put this in the talk overview, kind of a critical view on community energy per se, not energy democracy more broadly, but the idea that quasi-private organizations can lead the energy transition without any sort of real attention to energy justice. And the rationale is because sometimes that's happening as the public sector is withdrawing, right? And the idea of community actors taking over the sector is part of a Trojan horse for broader privatization of the sector. That is part of the discussion in some places, right? So that narrative of it's open to competition and community can compete just with the other actors gets us back to that kind of neoliberal setting. And in reality, unless you have really strong policies to enable communities, and communities broadly conceived as the whole group of people in an area and not just a smaller group of investors in an area, you need those policies in place to ensure that a community energy development is also just and part of a more robust kind of energy transition. So Hoffman and High Pipper said in 2008, this is a bit old now, but it still rings true for me, there are alternate ways to get more renewables. If your tick box is we need fossil fuels to switch to renewables, there are ways probably to roll that out really quickly, and it doesn't have to be community-based. But there are also alternate paths to deepen democracy. If democracy is our problem we want to solve, maybe the energy sector isn't the place we should be putting a lot of our apples. Maybe we should be doing in other places. And this is just with the view of efficient allocation of resources, to stick with kind of the neoliberal theme. But if we're really worried about democracy, maybe don't focus too much on energy. So this isn't me arguing this, but me saying that there's a real debate there about what the relative trade-off is in terms of, opening the door for community also opens the door for something else unless you have really, really strong kind of policy guidance on what kinds of organizations you want to open up decentralization to. Another challenge is the instrumental treatment of citizen participation. So the idea of allowing citizens to participate but not necessarily taking what they say seriously at all or incorporating it into plans. The risks of this are that, like, let's say today you were invited to a consultation and I allowed you to talk. And if after that happened, I went away and did what I wanted anyway, particularly if you didn't have extra time on your hands, you'd found babysitters for your kids, you'd traveled 2 hours, you would likely be furious. Most people don't have all of that extra time. So the more marginalized a population is, the more damaging that's going to be. And for many populations we might want to be inclusive of, we don't want to undermine any future participation. So this kind of instrumental, coercive participation in some ways, or at least, giving a nod to it, is really problematic. So Walker and Divine Wright and some others said in 2010, for some government actors running capital funding programs, motives for community energy were fairly narrow. How do we get them to approve the project for another actor? How do we get them to not oppose it, essentially? Concern, for example, with using government money to stimulate the market for renewables. So this was about, again, this is the Trojan horse bit, more green growth, development of renewables, and allowing other actors to continue doing what they're doing while giving a nod to democracy and participation. And that's quite challenging. Another part is, and here's more moving to that kind of picture down at the right, it says actually every disaster movie starts with the government ignoring scientists. But I would argue, yes, but every climate policy disaster starts with people being ignored, society being ignored, the broad swath, this is going to fit on a slogan. I have an issue with protest signs. But the idea that it's not just about ignoring scientists. It's about ignoring the concerns of people who need to pay their bills and need a job. So, for example, in the Canadian context, workers in the oil sands, workers in energy industries that are going to lose their jobs and still need to pay their mortgage. This gets us back to just transition. So actually dealing with the fears and interests of more than the energy sector is essential. So I think climate policy without that is going to be a disaster because you can't often redo it. You'll erode any sort of trust and willingness to move forward. And incumbent actors are a real challenge here. So Hargreaves, in an article, they were saying, competition from more powerful mainstream groups who may develop watered-down alternatives and the general risk aversion of policymakers when dealing with small-scale, often radical, and relatively informal, innovating organizations. So policy actors have a particular way of doing things and a particular language that they're used to listening to. And often that's incumbent industrial energy actors, right? They have been working together for many years. And so to the extent that community actors are involved, there's a pushback to fit into the box that the sector has been developing. And of course, that's exactly the potential benefit of inclusive energy transitions, is changing the language to reach more people, to change the ideas that people have. So I am in no way thinking that this is any sort of easy thing. This is a big challenge, right? Some of the way that this manifests is, for some groups I was interviewing in the UK, even the reporting requirements when they receive either grants or energy subsidies for a nonprofit or a lower wage or volunteer based, as some of these organizations are, tank the project, right? There's a way that large energy companies are able to operate because they have decades of profit and institutional knowledge and all of this behind them, that these new actors who have all the benefits of new voices and recirculating money, they can't compete on that level. And that's why that kind of soft cost policy support is really important. But it's also why some people say maybe this is just in the too hard basket. Maybe, again, there are other ways to deepen democracy in a society, and this is one we shouldn't. So just putting that out there. And the last I didn't want to have a quote for because it got too quotey and wordy, but this is something I have been studying, and the UK is a perfect context of variable and uncertain policy support, which is you have this great idea, you want to start a project, the funding's there, you mobilize all your support, you get the right actors in the room, you get it all going, you get a grant, and then the policy changes. And your whole community industry is essentially gutted. This happened in the UK where those feed-in tariffs for communities came in. All these communities developed these solar power projects, and the money was going to go back into low carbon transitions and community pubs and all of this. And they hired lots of people to install and all of this, and these cuts decimated that sector. So now the community energy sector in the UK is looking at using some of the groups they mobilized together to do other activities, but that's a huge waste of time and energy and money, essentially, right? And so that's not what we want to be doing with the pressing nature of the climate crisis. Okay, so my summary. So energy democracy and justice are not automatic elements of an energy transition. It is very likely that any energy transition, to the extent that one happens in Canada or other places, will be led by corporate actors and not by communities. And it won't necessarily involve more women in those jobs or more new actors in those jobs. Sometimes there's this idea that a transition in and of itself will be progressive in other ways, and that is not the case. It requires significant mobilization to democratize and form new organizations and start new projects, and it requires, as I've already said a couple of times, targeted policies to support and enable those groups. What you do find is without that targeting, you get a form of community energy which isn't particularly planned and may not be particularly inclusive. It's not that it doesn't exist, it's that it exists in ways that doesn't necessarily reach the wide number of actors that you might want. So I am also finding that state actors who are bringing in policies and supports for community energy, this term is slipping now. It's going from community or collective into local, right? And so there's a difference between local as in proximate and community as in a group of people with shared values and ownership. Community is also a slippery term, but that collective element is moving to local. And there are some implications of that I need to work through. But more often as well, it's slipping from local as well into prosumer, producing consumer. And a prosumer can be an individual. And so a lot of the kind of policy people I've been interviewing, especially in energy ministries and energy regulators, they've been talking about enabling citizen participation. But what they really mean is you in the smart grid as an individual in your house, right? Or being able to change your provider. That's your participation. And that's a very different thing, I hope you'll know by this point in the talk, between energy democracy in the way that a lot of other people, but the language sounds so similar that you can understand how people would think that one is the other, right? Citizen participation is all of this other stuff as well. The other point I think I've made is that local communities in New Zealand and in other places are playing really diverse roles. It's not just about power generation. It's about retrofits and energy efficiency and transport and grid development. It's about whatever the energy needs are of a place that enables people to get what they want. It could be lower power bills. It could be a shift away from fossil fuels and very fossil fuel heavy context. It depends. When I was at Sussex recently, there's a man from Ghana and a man from Nigeria who were doing graduate research there, and they came up and they said, how does this apply
do you think, in where I'm from? And first I said, I don't know the context, so I can't answer that. However, we went on to talk about it, and in one case, the state is essentially captured by fossil fuel interests, and many people have no electricity access. So is there a role, and indeed there is some literature on this, in community and local energy with support from potentially international actors or other financing to leapfrog from no electricity to renewable microgrids or renewable kind of powered kind of very small systems. So, I mean, there's a lot of research trying to look at the applicability beyond Western industrialized nations. But as I said, I think they are the case where, from a justice point of view, most needs to be done most quickly. That they have we have the resources, and we should be doing this more than we are. The organizational structure, I didn't really talk about this too much, but another kind of summary finding I want to leave you with is that so some of these actors are local authorities, but other ones are cooperatives, and other ones are trusts. And in every jurisdiction, and in Canada, even every province has its own Cooperatives Act. And so this is, again, why deep empirical research in different places is so important, because you cannot just transfer what happens somewhere else to your location. Not only are the policies different, the resources different, but those legal frameworks that set out how participation has to happen in the company. Do you get a vote for the board? Does it matter whether anyone shows up to your annual meeting? Is that democratic if it's not? You can say in theory they could, but they don't. There's a lot of kind of nitty-gritty details that many of those benefits about democracy and participation hang on. And you want to understand those kind of legal forms. Partnerships have been really key. So that Middelgrunden project was only possible really because of the institutional backing, the pockets, the staff, the space of the local utility with the cooperative. And the cooperative helped redesign the whole project from 3 turbines going out that had some opposition to one pretty neat arc that now stag parties want to go and check out, right? So the redesign of the project itself, but the project was really large, as I said. So it was enabled because of a partnership. And there are different implications between private sector partnerships and public. But those require actual investigation as to who the private actor is. In the UK, I said that there was this massive policy reversal, leaving a lot of local community projects hanging. Well, when I was just there, one of the retail, so they buy and sell power, Midlands Cooperative got into that business during the UK boom in community energy and has just partnered with Octopus Energy, a private firm, to buy power off community energy generation projects across the UK. So even without state support, they've created a fund so that they will continue supporting these organizations, buying and selling. So they've kind of created their own sort of market for this. So unintended consequences have pushed these actors into new and novel ways of operating, and partnerships are part of that. I already mentioned that the land claim settlements through the Treaty of Waitangi or Te Tiriti have been really important catalyst in the New Zealand context. So again, looking at involving, but also kind of following the lead of Indigenous communities and ensuring that that we don't necessarily discuss their role in these transitions as one of, just needing help and support, but actually having ideas and also projects and knowledge that we need to learn from rather than, help out in some way. So there's some of the geothermal knowledge, for example, in New Zealand, I think it was Ngāti Whātua, may have gone to, there's an article on this I'm happy to share afterwards, may have gone to Kenya to talk to the Maasai about setting up geothermal and how to partner with the state and own and kind of run new projects in the geothermal area. So that's quite exciting. But more than anything else, the network and movement building that comes out of these actors trying to make change in the sector, as I said with that kind of Midlands Co-op Octopus Energy partnership, they're building social networks that then continue to do other activities, even if the original project falls apart. So I know I said there's a risk in really exhausting people and making them frustrated, and there is. But policies that kind of jumpstart a sector create new linkages and capacities and ideas as well. And so if they're there long enough, then they can develop some resilience. And that's really what I'm looking for, is a way to, beyond an electoral cycle, develop what E.O. Wright calls countervailing power, a mobilized network of groups who can keep pushing and innovating and mobilizing and ideally growing. So this November, we're having a New Zealand Forum for Local and Community Energy in Auckland. We had one another year, and the whole idea of having this, bringing policymakers and energy sector actors and community energy actors together, is to create these links and networks, right? So in New Zealand, those kind of 4 categories that I highlighted, a lot of them don't necessarily talk to each other or think of themselves as a sector. That's growing now. There's a really fabulous New Zealand Community Energy Network that was mostly energy efficiency and are now looking at grid innovations and talking to other groups and whatnot. So it's exciting times down there, but there's a lot more to do. So thanks for your attention today, and I'd love to answer any questions you might have.